when there is an organic open source community around technology, I think it's so fascinating to look for ways to build a commercial engine that both complements and amplifies that original creative community without co-opting it or worse, extinguishing it. One of the most interesting things to emerge from the internet is that humans will get together and self-organize to create things like this and to work on projects like this. Who wouldn't want to support that and find ways to amplify it?
You're listening to the Enterprise Ready podcast, a show aiming to change the enterprise software narrative from how to sell to enterprises to how to build for enterprises. We'll interview industry experts and enterprise software founders as we break through the jargon, establish a common vernacular, and share the lessons learned from building the world's best enterprise software. Hi, I'm Grant Miller, creator of Enterprise Ready and founder and CEO of Replicated, where we enable cloud-native software vendors like HashiCorp, CircleCI, Sneak, and many others to operationalize and scale the distribution of their modern on-prem applications. Check us out at replicated.com. The Enterprise Ready podcast is brought to you by Heavybit, a program dedicated to helping startups take their developer products to market. For more information, visit heavybit.com. If you're interested in being a guest on the show, or if you'd like to suggest a topic, or just learn more about enterprise features, find us at enterpriseready.io.
In this episode of the Enterprise Ready podcast, Grant sits down with Donald Fischer, CEO and co-founder of Tidelift. The conversation begins with Donald's early career history, starting with a quick stint at Oracle before joining Inktomi, an early search engine, as a senior consultant. As a self-admitted Linux geek, Donald's career led him to Red Hat, where he worked as a product manager on Red Hat Enterprise Linux. Both as massive proponents of open source software, the pair discuss the power of open source hobbyists and the effect on the course of entrenched commercial products. They go on to discuss how Intel and x86 architecture became the rising tide for Red Hat's success and led to the company becoming the dominant vendor in the space. The conversation shifts to Donald's stints in the world of venture capital, the founding of Tidelift, and how to best support open source creators at scale by focusing on the communities that catalyze projects. This episode should not be missed for anyone working or interested in open source. Many thanks to Donald for his time, and we hope you enjoy.
All right, Donald, thank you so much for joining.
Glad to be here. Thanks for the invitation, Grant.
All right, let's dive in a little bit. How did you end up in enterprise software?
A grand accident, or a series of accidents, I guess. But I'm happy to talk a little about the path. So I started as a software developer. Actually, I started as a software enthusiast, computer nerd type in my youth. Studied computer science, graduated and became a professional software developer. And I also became, in my youth and into my early career, a real enthusiast of what was then called free software, the free software movement, now kind of cleaned up for enterprise consumption as open source software. So, spent a lot of my energy in college on, compiling my Linux kernel and things like that, where I probably might have had better things to do, but that's how I chose to use my time. And early in my career as a software developer, I was the annoying Linux guy who couldn't open your Word document because it wasn't in an open format. And eventually, everyone got frustrated enough that I decided to go join my tribe at Red Hat, which it was my favorite company of the era. I had been a Red Hat Linux user for years, the sort of hobbyist product that folks may or may not know about anymore. But Red Hat really started out for technology enthusiasts to use on their home systems and so on. So I showed up at Red Hat and they said, "Hey, we're starting an enterprise business. Do you want to work on that?" And I said, "What's an enterprise business?"
Perfect. Where had you worked prior to Red Hat? Where were you before that?
Well, I did a quick stint at Oracle, which was kind of amazing. And actually, I learned things there that I have been useful throughout my career, even though I was there less than a year.
Wow.
And then I was in the Bay. Living in the Bay Area, and I worked for a really incredible company called Inktomi. That was a recently public company. This was about 1999, 2000 or so. And Inktomi was an early search engine and also content distribution software company. So it was all building on some of the research that had been done around cluster computing networks of workstations coming out of UC Berkeley.
Oh, cool.
Founded by Eric Brewer and a few other folks. And Eric is now, well known for his role at Google today. But really, really fascinating, kind of deeply academic computer science world there that I loved hanging out around.
Oh, interesting. So how big was that company when you joined?
A couple hundred people already. This was sort of the go-go expansion days of the internet bubble. Yeah.
Oh, nice. Yeah. The pre-bust, I guess, in like the late 90s.
Exactly. Yep.
It's funny. Like, yeah, I mean, I guess Eric Brewer, I guess his role at Google then, I mean, sort of on the infrastructure side, right? And is that sort of the background, or what
well, I mean, basically the company was about applying the idea of clustering commodity systems together to build scale applications. And the use cases were like a search engine that powered the back end of, at the time, Yahoo and MSN and things like that, and then a second application to basically do like streaming video delivery for telecommunications providers. So really, fun, exciting early internet stuff. And, I essentially worked in the mailroom there and felt glad to be invited to the party, even in the most junior role early in my career.
Interestingly, I guess that core thesis became, did Inktomi get acquired by Google, or what?
Inktomi eventually ended up getting mostly acquired by Yahoo, I believe is the sequence of corporate transactions there.
Oh, okay. But you really were, the Linux geek who was mainly excited to join Red Hat. And so you joined Red Hat in what sort of role?
Yeah, so I joined as a product manager, which I'm not exactly sure how it all happened because I had no experience or right to be a product manager, but I kind of showed up willing and able to do whatever, as a practicing software developer. And there was an opportunity. They were looking for a technical product manager for a new product that at the time was called Red Hat Linux Advanced Server. But within a year or so, it was renamed Red Hat Enterprise Linux, which is what it's called to today. And, basically the idea was we have this hobbyist operating system, Red Hat Linux, sold at the bookstore. I used to go to Barnes & Noble and buy the CDs. There was like a $30 version that had one manual in it. And there was the pro version that had two manuals in it for like $50. Get the CD so you don't have to download slowly off the internet at the time.
Sure.
And the idea of the advanced server business was, hey, maybe this could be a real commercial quality operating system to go head to head with Windows Server, with Solaris, sort of on the Intel x86 stack, be a modern Linux to run on x86. And the idea seemed kind of crazy that you could do that, but the power of open source was already demonstrating that this sort of hobbyist thing was in many ways already better than some of those entrenched commercial products. And then I got to be part of the team that we just kind of figured it out as we went along.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. So, I mean, we have to dive in here. This feels like we can get some really interesting kind of context and backstory on, clearly one of the most important companies in open source, particularly in open source enterprise software. I mean, RHEL, it's the gold standard in many ways, set a lot of the business model, did many things. So, rewind, take us back to that time. Tell us about what was your early team like? What were the insights? What were the challenges? What did you learn along the way? Like, let's really revisit that because that's super interesting.
Yeah. So, where to start? I mean, the team you mentioned was incredible. I mean, there were, so many of the key open source, or again, at that time, largely free software history people, on the technical side of the business. And I'm, met a number of folks there, a couple of folks I worked with in that era later went on to be my co-founders of my current company with me. So we'll maybe talk about that in a bit. And, one of the interesting things that was happening when I got there to Red Hat, where, Red Hat had been around for a while when this enterprise business got started, there was sort of an infusion of folks who had done it before with lineage going back to like DEC, Digital Equipment Corporation, and which had then, I guess, DEC got maybe acquired by Compaq, got acquired by HP, I think maybe was the sequence there. But these were folks who had built a commercial Unix before,
okay.
Both at DEC and then HBUX at HP. And so there was a really interesting moment there where there were kind of tenured folks who had done it before, and then these sort of like new wave open source hackers, and they combined into this small team to make it go. And it actually kind of sounds like a recipe for disaster if you describe that, but somehow it worked beautifully, I guess, because everyone was able to focus on the software and just making it work. It actually really worked out nicely in terms of the organizational dynamics.
I mean, so what was like the key thesis? It was like sort of, hey, this server product. I mean, one, I guess, like, was the sort of consumer version of Red Hat like remotely successful? How big was the company? Like, give us context around company and everything else at that point.
Yeah, I mean, it was not the Red Hat of today that people are familiar with when it was selling the kind of low cost consumer hobbyist product through the bookstore channel. I mean, it was actually like there were some bizarre attributes to it. Like, it would literally be sold as a book through these bookstores and so on. And so there were issues like when we came out with a new version of the software, the bookstores would send back all the previous versions of it because it was treated like a prior edition of a book, and like the paper would have to get discarded, shredded, or something like that. So I think that was a very challenged go-to-market path. And look, the idea for the enterprise opportunity was essentially Intel-based servers presented the opportunity to have much better hardware cost dynamics than the traditional RISC-based servers. The original reason why transporting back was basically the enterprise platforms could take advantage of some of the scale advantages of using consumer tech in an enterprise context. And the big opportunity was businesses that were used to building workloads that ran on Unix needed a Unix that ran on Intel x86 architectures. And interestingly, at that time, there was a x86 version of Solaris, which was sort of the dominant, contemporaneous Unix of that time.
Sure.
But of course, Sun had some strategy reasons for not deplatforming their own hardware, SPARC chips. And so it took a while for Solaris x86 to be released. And that created the opportunity for, an independent Intel targeted Unix. And Linux had developed through the sort of hobbyist, and Red Hat's distribution of Linux had developed through the hobbyist channel over the recent years. And it was almost good enough to be an enterprise class operating system, just needed a little bit of additional polish and work that only took another 15 years to finish. We're probably never done.
That's interesting. So I always think about, the opportunities that are created for businesses often revolve around platform shifts. And it sounds like the platform shift in this regard was this idea of Intel-based servers, like, x86 architecture versus kind of the more traditional RISC. Is that accurate?
Yeah. I mean, that was the slam dunk use case at the dawn of Red Hat's enterprise business was, today I run Oracle database on Solaris on SPARC hardware, and I would like to reduce my hardware costs by running my Oracle database on something on an Intel-based server. And that something was what was up for grabs. And Red Hat successfully grabbed that in the early days and became the dominant vendor in that space.
Yeah. And so, that success of x86 architecture and Intel largely became the rising tide that allowed Red Hat to really thrive.
Yeah. I mean, that was the core business driver. There was a lot that was necessary to, grab onto that force and channel it in the right way. But yeah, that was the tailwind that created the opportunity at the beginning.
And obviously, I know we're revisiting some amount of ancient history. You haven't worked at Red Hat in 13 years, right? So we're trying your memory here, but you're doing a great job. So I appreciate it.
Fond memories.
Yeah, good. But I guess the other part of that is like, one, I think maybe it was a very early podcast we did with Alex Polvey. He sort of alluded to the idea that Red Hat's business model is somewhat like predicated on the idea of employ all the core contributors, or at least like a majority of the core contributors, in order to sort of have like some say in direction. And then also there's a little bit of like Red Hat and the support model almost as like an insurance policy behind the sort of tooling. Would you say that those ideas were true, even 15 years ago when you were there?
Yeah, I mean, look, the Red Hat business model is like a much commented on, remarked, interpreted thing. So, I think there's a lot of subtle truths embedded in it. A couple of the elements, and it is, it really is a number of different elements that sort of combine to make it work then and now, although, the world evolves. So I think, a couple elements of the Red Hat model, the one that most folks attach to first, which I actually believe is not even the driver, not the most of the drive, is the support part of it. The like, hey, I got this error message from Apache.
What do I do? Right.
Yeah. How do I change my configuration file to, so Apache isn't complaining? Red Hat did that, but there were other businesses that did that as well at the time. There was like Linux Care and VA Linux and companies like that were doing support for Linux. I think one of the innovative elements, a really core innovative element, especially, reified in the form of Red Hat Enterprise Linux, was commercial quality kind of enterprise grade release engineering and engineering process, and that was one of the things that the infusion of folks who had done this for prior generation Unixes and operating systems before was really, really necessary in the ingredients that made up Red Hat. Knowing how to do consistent builds and QA and, create and manage a roadmap for features that would be added. And then there's a whole it's actually kind of another cluster of value around providing a common platform to ensure compatibility for things that you use with the operating system. And Red Hat was in a really interesting spot, especially in those days where there were a bunch of independent hardware companies building server hardware. Now in the modern age, that includes the clouds, but they weren't there in the early 2000s yet. So you would have, IBM had Intel-based servers, Dell had Intel-based servers, Fujitsu Siemens had Intel-based servers, a lot of those. So that's sort of like the southbound interface. Like Red Hat's job was run consistently on all of those different platforms that are using different chipsets. They're typically using the same Intel and AMD chips. And there's a huge value to just having something that runs across all of those.
Sure.
And then there's a northbound API as well for Red Hat, which is like the applications, Oracle, at the time, BEA WebLogic, whatever the enterprise workloads are. And, they wanted one platform to target. And so Red Hat was able to play that role. So that's like a kind of a third element. If there's like support, there's like the release engineering kind of enterprise, software release and process stuff. And then a third, really awesome opportunity that Red Hat had was creating a consistent platform to mediate between all these different companies and building applications and all of these different companies building hardware that the operating system would run on. I guess it's been well remarked that, MS-DOS and Microsoft Windows had some really interesting dynamics around them. And Red Hat, I think, benefited from some of the same dynamics that sort of solidified their opportunity.
Yeah, it's great to sort of double click on, what does support mean, right? Because it's like there's like this idea that support is break fix. Like we got an error and we need to figure out what's going on. But to your point, like supported software is actually much more than that, right? It's actually like someone is going to consistently be responsible for like maintenance and patching and for, continuing to enhance the product as the world changes and as the underlying, sort of both northbound and southbound, as those things change, like make sure that the underlying tooling like works with it and adapts to it. So like that roadmap. But then this idea of commercial grade release engineering, right, around consistent builds and QA is something that I haven't heard many folks talk about, but I think is really interesting. Like, is that something that you would have, did you market that? Was that like this is a core feature, or was that just sort of like a expectation, like a table stakes? Like, how do you think about that feature, that sort of value?
Yeah, I think it's an implicit feature of enterprise software, at least of enterprise platform software. If you just think about, if you've done, well, let's transport ourselves back into the early 2000s. The dominant enterprise products and, service providers, companies, vendors of that time, if you bought the Oracle database, yes, it came with a support line that you could call to ask about the error message that you got, or, for help installing it or something like that. But also it came with a release roadmap and, specification of how long version 8, I think, was contemporaneous with the era that we're talking about. How long is version 8 going to be maintained for and continue to get updates?
Mm-hmm.
And, if you built a product against Oracle database version 8, your application product, there were a set of APIs that were held stable so that when you updated the database, your application didn't break. So Red Hat, had a similar set of requirements. Again, they're kind of implicit, but, maintaining secure or maintaining stable, I should say, interfaces for other things to plug into them. And by the way, that was like one of the core things to figure out, where I give huge credit to the engineering teams and engineers at Red Hat for figuring out how to take something that had emerged through a very, sort of organic, real open, early free software, open source community creation process, which was Linux and the components of the Linux distribution, the user land and all of that, and basically match it to a world where people are expecting things like long-term stable APIs to build their applications against and deploy. And it was really hard to do things like, one of the things that Red Hat Enterprise Linux did early, and it was extremely hard and continues to be hard today, is providing guarantees around, stable APIs to the Linux kernel. Sometimes it required going and redoing work or taking work from, the most recent releases and transplanting that back into an older version of the Linux kernel that organizations still needed to rely on without breaking any of the symbols or compatibility. It's really hard stuff. And so that, I think, is, to me, that's sort of the undersung element of the Red Hat product model, I might call it. It's not really a business model, but it's part of the product value received. And I've always been fascinated by that, and came back to that element of it later in my career because it's particularly powerful, I think, and important.
Yeah. The one thing that must have been challenging for Red Hat is a lot of open source projects today, the creator, because if there is a commercial entity, it gets built around the creator, right? So HashiCorp is a recent example, right? Like, Mitchell and Armand created these projects. They then became commercial. They built a company around it. They kind of own a lot of it. Or, you think about the successful model of Kubernetes, which is more, or Apache, these kind of community-based pieces. And Linux has Linux Foundation clearly, which, even drives a lot of these things. But like, that model probably wasn't nearly as baked out, especially when you were kind of starting, right? And the sort of Linus relationship with Linux must have been unique and sort of interesting as well, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was a different model back then. And I think it actually required a level of helpful humility that has served Red Hat well, over the years.
Yeah.
To figure out how to participate, how to join and participate and engage with existing communities that had arisen for all kinds of different reasons. And again, remember, like in the early days of Red Hat's enterprise business, it was also the early days of the phrase open source, right? Before that, a lot of the motivation for these things to exist was, in some cases, a political motivation, right? About beliefs of, that the software, especially core system software, should be free software, free as in freedom, and should be compatible with, should adhere to, like the 4 freedoms that are still part of the open source definition. And so, I think it's really impressive in retrospect that a company was able to wade into that world in a constructive way, engage with those communities that maybe had started for other reasons to adapt the technology to new use cases, like, big companies and governments running their enterprise workloads that were never imagined. They clearly weren't. If you look back at Linus's his first famous first email post, just a hobby, or listserv post, starting something just a hobby, nothing serious. It's pretty remarkable that Red Hat was able to pioneer that model of partnering with those things. And that, one of the things I took away from that personally was I've since looked for ways to repeat elements of that, in the sense of, when there is an organic open source community around technology, I think it's so fascinating to look for ways to build a commercial engine that both complements and amplifies that original creative community without co-opting it, or worse, extinguishing it, right? but it's something that's additive that basically results in a net increase of energy and productivity and creativity in the open source ecosystem, whichever, sub ecosystem that might be.
Yeah. I mean, what are there some ways that you found to be successful in doing that?
Yeah, well, I mean, some of this gets into, what the models that we're applying now with Tidelift, with my current venture. But, again, I think there's a qualitative difference in the patterns that you see between open source projects and communities that were born for expressly commercial purposes and those that were born, for in the sense of like being a product, an open source technology that was created to, be a company or a product, versus those that arose more organically through a set of collaborators. Not to say that they weren't being used in a professional way or something like that, but that the actual open source project or community did not have an overt commercial intent to start with. And I think there's lots that sort of fit, our mix, where there's up front, there's a commercial intent from the originator of the project or the originators of the project that then, a community forms around. Sometimes, though, and I think even more interesting are the cases where it's more the community forms, a community of users form and create something, and then there's an opportunity for a commercial element to be built alongside of it. But that needs to be done with care and discretion.
Yeah, that's a great point.
And Red Hat, just to square the circle, is really an example of the latter for sure. I mean, that stuff, the key projects existed a priori,
right?
And then Red Hat figured out a way to constructively engage with them to cause them to meet these enterprise standards that were necessary. And that was a great thing for Red Hat, but it was also a great thing for those open source communities that Red Hat participated in to do it.
Yeah, I would say clearly, Red Hat's impact on the open source sort of ecosystem, even in the projects that it's not directly impacted, has been dramatic, right? As a model that others follow, as an example of like how to build a great business that is complementary to an amazing open source community. So, it's oftentimes the total economic impact of a company like that that's doing something in a fairly unique way. The largest impact isn't even the direct impact that it creates, but rather the impact that the example that it sets, and then in these sort of countless others who are inspired by that to actually create their own sort of interpretation and apply it somewhere else.
Agree.
Yeah. So yeah, let's I obviously I want to spend a ton of time on Tidelift here in a bit, but let's just dip into, went to the dark side for a little bit, right? So you joined up with some venture funds, likely still spending a lot of time, in the enterprise and open source space, but talk about, some of those experiences there, because I think that was nearly a decade of, inside of large venture funds. So.
Yeah, so I took a weird career detour and ended up, as you said, working as an early stage investor at a couple of venture capital firms. Actually, the first firm I worked for was Greylock, which had been the Series A investor in Red Hat. So that's how I had gotten to know some folks over there.
Oh, okay, interesting. I didn't know that actually.
Yeah, and so that was great. And again, like, common occurrence in my career has been showing up not knowing anything about the job about to do. So just like I didn't know anything about how to be a product manager when I showed up at Red Hat, didn't know anything about venture capital really when I showed up at Greylock. So, it was great to learn the business there from some of the best practitioners ever with historic, investments and returns during that period. And then I spent another number of years, almost 5 years, at General Catalyst, another tier one VC firm. And at General Catalyst, I was really focused on pursuing this interest around open source communities and finding commercial opportunities to either support existing companies or even create new companies to amplify open source projects and open source community ecosystems. And I'm so thankful for both my partners who indulged that appetite for what at the time was not a very, popular thesis,
not a hot market,
but also especially the entrepreneurs that I was able to work with during that time. And I got a chance to, participate in a number of investments and serve on the boards of a number of open source companies a couple examples would be Anaconda, originally called Continuum Analytics, is a company in the kind of centered on the Python data science ecosystem. So really amazing to work with, Travis Oliphant and Peter Wang, the two founders there from a relatively early stage. I mean, Travis, who I love and I think is one of the greatest open source creators of the open source era. I mean, he literally sat down and wrote what is now NumPy and SciPy, as an individual creator spark of genius. And then that led to a whole ecosystem that is now the Python data science ecosystem. And then that created the opportunity for Anaconda, the company, to, again, amplify, reinforce, bring more energy and capability to that ecosystem. So that was super fun to work on. Worked with some really great entrepreneurs building what was initially a mobile app development and now is a cross-platform app development platform called Ionic. So really great company, amazing entrepreneurs there. Again, Max Lynch, the founder CEO there,
sure,
original author, instigator of the project, but a huge community that has grown around that in that world. And then a third one that has been really gratifying to support over the years is Julia Computing around a novel language, which is hard to birth a new programming language and ecosystem around it. And Julia is really focused on, what some folks call technical computing, like, scientific computing use cases, now kind of blending into, AI and ML worlds. And, again, was privileged to work with the founders there, Viral Shah and his co-founders, Jeff and Keno and Professor Edelman from MIT to help stand up the business around that, which is now great going concern business, really innovating in a community that needs new tools to accomplish important things for society.
Yeah, those are all three, incredible companies. And you're still are you still on the board of two of them, maybe?
Yeah, I have been able to. One of the nice things is even after, stepping out of the VC role to start Tidelift, which we'll talk about in a bit, I have been able to continue supporting some of those entrepreneurs as a director.
Oh, that's great.
Which is a great perspective to bring to my own business, actually, as well, because you learn a lot of things.
Oh,
yeah.
I'm sure. Do you stay on in still representing the preferred, or do you kind of take a different seat in that world?
Yeah, in these cases, I'm still representing the original, the firm that made the original investment.
Cool. Yeah, I guess maybe because you didn't go to another venture fund, it's still a solid relationship. You can do that, and I think, and even when we get into Tidelift here, did General Catalyst write one of your first checks? Is that right?
Yes, indeed. I'm glad to say my partners backed me with a crazy idea. The call was coming from inside the house, as they say in the horror movies.
Okay, yeah. So let's get into Tidelift. I mean, so I think we've set some really great context around how you've had a very long career and a ton of experience with open source and commercial open source, and you've seen this evolve. And I mean, really, you were at the earliest sort of stages of what the kind of commercial open source enterprise software really looks like, and so now we have that context, and it seems to me, who I have a little context on Tidelift, it seems pretty obvious as to where you were inspired, but let's tie it all together. Tell us about, sort of the founding days of Tidelift and what made you decide it was time to leave the cushy job as a venture capitalist to struggle as an entrepreneur.
Yeah, happy to do it. So it does follow somewhat linearly out of this set of interests around open source technologies and specifically the human communities around those technologies. But also it stems from some of the elements that we were talking about, like what were the ingredients of the product model at Red Hat and subsequent commercial open source companies. And so one of the things that became very clear to me as I was looking at investing in net new companies that were being started around open source projects is that there are certainly some companies that fit that model, some projects that have that obvious opportunity around them, right? So you can think of companies like Confluent around Apache Kafka and that ecosystem,
sure.
Or a couple of the companies that I already mentioned that I was privileged to be involved in. But most open source projects do not fit that model. They're never going to pass that test that this makes sense to start a Series A, make a Series A multi-million-dollar investment in starting a company around this open source project. And the part that really, captured my interest was all of the class of open source projects that are used very widely by almost every large organization, but don't make sense to be a company of their own. So, specifically, talking about the libraries and frameworks that are used in application development. And there's a very kind of broad, eclectic mix of these that comprise actually like the modern application development platform. You're talking about packages across programming languages like JavaScript and Java, PHP, Ruby, Python, .NET. Every one of those has web frameworks, UI frameworks, but also parser libraries and string manipulation libraries and all of these things. And we all rely on those. Every modern application development team relies on those. But it just clearly doesn't make sense to start a Series A backed VC company around every string parsing library for a lot of good reasons, right? But it's like a paradox. We depend on this stuff. It needs to work. And, we sort of, at the beginning, mostly theorized that really bad things could happen to users of these packages if they weren't validated or supported to meet certain standards, the kinds of things that Red Hat did in that release engineering kind of, body of work for Linux in yesteryear. And yet, how can we do it? And, I got to talking about this with a couple of gentlemen who wound up becoming my co-founders at Tidelift. So, for example, Havoc Pennington, who was co-creator of the GNOME project and the GNOME Foundation. That's the UI for Linux, UI layer for Linux, and a collaborator back at Red Hat. Jeremy Katz, core Red Hat engineer who did a lot of the work on the installer and package manager for the Linux distribution, then went on to make a number of other really important contributions. He was led the engineering team at Stackdriver that was sold to Google. It's now the sort of monitoring front end of Google Cloud. And then Luis Villa, who is known to a lot of folks as one of the few world-renowned experts on open source law and licensing. Actually, Luis drafted the Mozilla Public License version 2. That's the version that's in use when he was working with Mozilla. So I started talking to folks like this and saying, how can we resolve this paradox? Like, one question is like, why don't some of the existing vendors just run up the stack and cover those packages? They're used. It would be valuable for organizations to have assurances around those. And then just like, also, how are we going to support these open source maintainers who are in a pretty strange state right now where they have, millions of people, but also these like global corporations and governments depending on their work. And, there's lots of good reasons why open source creators show up to do that. And when it gets to scale, a lot of it starts to become things like impact, knowing that they're having a really positive impact through their creativity and their work on the world. But then there's these like obligations that kind of start creeping in, like, okay, now that I've got million users of my library, wait a minute, I'm getting all these messages of people complaining about bugs in it. Do I have an obligation to these people to do this, to fix these problems? Do I have an obligation to do enterprise grade release engineering around it? It seemed like an unsolved question. And so the idea that we came up with was, could we kind of take a page out of some of the then contemporaneous kind of modern business models around gig economy businesses like Uber and Lyft and Airbnb, it almost kind of fit what was actually going on around and what is actually going on around open source communities, where there's this diffuse network of individuals who are creating this really valuable set of capabilities, right? In this case, open source projects. They're already doing, they're causing the software to exist to some degree. Maybe they're not doing all of the kind of boring enterprise release engineering work that big companies who use that stuff might want them to do. How could we give them a reason to do it? And so we sort of adopted the business model of, working with these open source maintainers on a fractional basis, agreeing on some standards that we want those software packages to meet that are fairly universal, right? Like mapping what open source vulnerabilities are in it, having a security response policy, a responsible disclosure policy for security vulnerabilities, identifying what the license is for the packages, providing some signal around, is this actively maintained? Is this deprecated or out of maintenance? We ask them to do that. We pay them on a fractional basis. It's kind of a side hustle for the vast majority of the maintainers that we work with. And it just gives them for one thing, it gives them a sort of reason and excuse to bring their packages up to a standard. And then it also honestly like recognizes and demonstrates appreciation to these folks for creating this thing in the first place and then sticking with it when everybody on the internet starts complaining about how it didn't work on their Commodore 64 or when they used it in this bizarre combination. It just seemed like a good idea. So that was the original kind of idea. I think to ground it in our earlier conversation, it comes back to some of those. We focus on, if you look at the Red Hat Enterprise Linux product model that we talked about, we focus on that release engineering portion of it. That's really an interesting opportunity around these open source libraries. And it's been, fortunately and unfortunately demonstrated through some recent events, the actual value of having a plan together and having some proactive tools and process around this class of libraries.
Cool. Yeah. I mean, so clearly what you're referring to there is maybe the biggest security bug that anyone has seen in some number of years with the Log4j issues, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
I mean, so talk about that. Like it's probably a really good way for folks to sort of get a concrete example of like the thing that you just described a little bit. Like let's talk through details of like how, Tidelift could have helped or what could have happened or, what maybe you'll do in the future and what the problem is.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's kind of amazing when the arcane world of open source software and enterprise release engineering kind of jargon like this breaks through into the mainstream world. I'm looking at the day that we're recording this podcast, on the front page of the Washington Post is an article, "The most serious security breach ever is unfolding right now. Here's what you need to know." So it's pretty, It doesn't always happen, but I think it really demonstrates the point that companies rely on this universe of open source packages, especially for application development, not just as sort of operating systems, but the building blocks of applications. Governments rely on it. Society relies on it, right? Like sure. When this Log4j vulnerability broke about a week before we're recording here, several large parts of the Canadian government took their systems offline, including, I believe, the Canadian Revenue Agency, the equivalent of the U.S. IRS, was offline. Many of their services were offline for a number of days while they tried to respond to Log4j. So it ends up having, real scale implications. The qualities and standards that these open source packages have and meet. And, Log4j, the package that's, is at the heart of this conversation around this vulnerability, I think it's a perfect example. In fact, I've often, used Log4j as a motivating example of the kind of package that we need to have a better solution for as a industry and as a society. It's like
even before this issue,
right? Because it's like it's a workaday package. It's kind of like low profile. Nobody's starting a Log4j VC-backed company, right?
Yeah.
But like almost every Java app, we've seen it verified now. Almost every enterprise Java application and many things you wouldn't expect incorporate Log4j to do this sort of important, but again, kind of like workaday task, writing log lines to a log file or log appender, and it demonstrates the fact that when you have an application that's built out of not just Log4j, but hundreds or thousands of things like Log4j, there's an asymmetric risk. If anything, goes wrong in a number of different ways with any of those packages, it can have a really, really huge impact on the organization that's using it, right? So in the case of security vulnerabilities, as we're seeing with Log4j, if your organization is using that and kind of not paying attention to where you're using it and what version of it that you're using, you could be vulnerable to, in this case, arbitrary remote code execution on your system could be used to steal customer data, worse, more creative things, change data, exfiltrate information. But there's other things that can go wrong that present asymmetric risk as well, right? So if you're a large organization and you're using, again, most a modern application, like a modern web application, will typically have hundreds or even sometimes thousands of package dependencies. If one or a couple of those have a sort of licensing ambiguity around them, open source licensing ambiguity could open up that company that looks like it has deep pockets to lawsuits, even if they're scurrilous lawsuits or sort of copyright troll kind of lawsuits, it's a pain in the neck, right? And it's a loss of time and energy and ultimately money to organizations to have to deal with that. And then, the most pernicious, I think, is when organizations are relying on these open source components that, again, were put out there by like generous people out of the goodness of their hearts for other folks to build on. But then if you end up depending on one of these packages in a critical piece of your business or organization, and it sort of goes out of maintenance or is no longer maintained, you have this form of technical debt that could really impair you in the future, right? And it tends to come up, that sort of lack of proactive maintenance tends to come up in really awkward times. Like a good example right now would be in this Log4j vulnerability. Many organizations, in going to respond to that, are finding, oh, actually, there's a bunch of interrelated things now that are getting dragged into the remediation. So, for example, I believe specifically the initial fix to Log4j that was shipped requires running on Java 8. And many organizations, subset, a minority, but many organizations still had workloads running on Java 7. So now the patching of Log4j involves a much bigger set of activities and stirring of a hornet's nest that involves, upgrading to a major new version with compatibility issues to mitigate of your core programming language. So those are the kinds of elements that we're looking to provide new solutions for packages like Log4j and the thousands of others that organizations that build modern software rely on.
Yeah, I mean, so sort of my understanding of the broader problem is like basically modern application development is built on the premise of like somewhat importing other code, right? Which you import other code as libraries. And those libraries, challengingly enough, also are built on other libraries. And so it ends up being, you might think you're using two, libraries, but each of those other libraries are using 50. So, when really you're adding two, you think you're actually adding 102. And so, and it's sort of downstream, this inheritance ends up being a major challenge. Part of it is, I'll kind of describe it as technical debt in the sense that like, it's a shortcut to get functionality faster when you leverage things that other people have done, right? Like the reusability and the like tooling around software development is part of what allows us to go so fast and to like build world-changing things because like, hey, you don't have to like redo all that work. It's already been done and somebody open sourced it and you can use it. The challenge there is like, clearly when there's a problem, which turns out sometimes software has bugs.
Sure does.
But when that happens, it's like, you have to update the package. Well, then like all your packages have to update their packages and like all the things that need to happen. And, so this is somewhat part of the overall like software supply chain conversation, right? There's also challenges in software supply chain, recently, maybe it was a year ago with SolarWinds. That was a bit of a different thing. That was like an actual, malicious actor who was, injecting like malicious Apple code into a software distribution. So this is different. This is just a bug. It's like, but I guess in a sense,
but it's being weaponized.
It's being weaponized, right?
Yeah.
Same thing, right? So it's like it doesn't matter if like I'm not at all saying that this bug was intentional, but like if someone intentionally wrote this in, then it would have been malicious code, and it's in there the same way, no matter what. And it's and so these backdoors, other things that happen in software. And it's a big problem that, one, most people aren't even aware of that it exists, right? And then the solutions are complicated. So talk about like what is Tidelifts' sort of position on the solution? Like how are you, helping? I'm going to guess that you're not like, oh yeah, we clearly solved this problem for everybody, today. It's kind of like it has to be part of a, hey, this is a path towards a solution. This is not, this is not the be all end all, but this is like, we need something better than what we're doing today. So you talk about what that is.
Yeah, absolutely. And, maybe just before I get into that, I do want to just point out that as far as all evidence that I've seen there, the Log4j vulnerability is unintentionally present. In fact, it's there in service of this, like, actually people complaining on the internet saying, please leave this turned on. This obscure legacy mode interface is actually the cause of it. And I just want to make sure that we honor the Log4j maintainers. They are doing God's work and they're doing great work. And there's no fault to them.
But this is a podcast, and the importance of conspiracy theories on podcasts. We can't, if we don't do our part, then what are we really doing a podcast?
I won't sign up for that part. But okay, so how are we going to make it better? Like, I think this is so actually it's easy to look at this landscape and just get paralyzed and say, where do we even start, right? Like, we're depending on thousands of things that are just kind of on the internet. Like, any of them could go bad and could be, have some unintended consequences like this. How are we going to get started? So
I think that's the most common response is like, back away slowly.
People don't want to talk about it. Honestly, yeah. I've been out there. Look, I've been out there for the last, either 20 years or 5 years, depending where you start counting, asking this question to people. What are you doing to, head off something like Log4j? And people don't like to talk about it, right? It's kind of like talking about life insurance.
The answer is not letting you talk to their CEO,
maybe. So what tools could we approach? So software isn't new, right? We've had software before. We've had commercial software before. When it didn't originate in open source communities or with independent creators on the internet, how did it work? When it all originated, look at Microsoft products in the late 1990s. They were almost entirely or majority written by Microsoft engineers sitting on the Microsoft campus in Redmond or wherever. Microsoft had some standards that they ensured that software met, right? And so, for example, there would be, it wasn't like Microsoft products or any software company had bug-free software, right? It's not like Red Hat did that for Linux. They didn't have a version of Linux that didn't have any bugs. They just had a process and systems in place to deal with the bugs with clarity on an urgent timeline and have a way to deal with them, right? So what does it require? It requires agreeing on some standards, some basic standards that to start with that software should meet, and then having a process and tools in place so that the folks who are laying hands on that software verify that it meets those standards or cause it to meet those standards. So, with Tidelift, one of the things that we do is we create these direct economic and business process relationships with the original open source creators or the current maintainers. And we give them tools and a standard set of processes to follow to ensure that the software meets objective kind of hygiene level standards, right? So an example standard that we want the software to meet that our customers are largely interested in is there is a version of the package that does not have a known security vulnerability in it, right? It's like in programmer speak, this is an invariant that you want to maintain, right? And so, it involves both looking at all the previous vulnerabilities that have been out there, marking which versions of which packages that they apply to. So you have the history, but then it's also how are you going to restore that invariant when it becomes breached, right? When there's a new security vulnerability, first of all, who's going to look at it? How are we going to tell people responsibly? It's called responsible disclosure, like, kind of letting vendors know so that they can be patched, have as much of a heads up as possible a priori, so that it's not just free fall 0-day mode like we were in with Log4j a week ago. And then also things like, what are the secure coding practices that we're going to have? What are the system security practices we're going to have? Basic things, using two-factor authentication on all of the different systems, like your source code collaboration tool like GitHub or GitLab, your package manager or package distribution system like NPM or Maven Central in the case of the Java ecosystem. Just making sure that there's, objectively mature software development practices being used there. Then there's aspects of it around documentation, right? Like with the licensing question, we need to get root source truth around like, what is the license of this? And then we need to put it into a machine readable format. And we have to put some metadata there to say like, not just that it looks like this has the Apache license, but this has the Apache license because this person is testifying that they wrote it and they gave it the Apache license. Very, very different situations, right? Mm. And then again, with those traditional commercial software products through the ages, they've also made promises about the future of the software. We will maintain this release stream until this date, so you can kind of plan ahead. And that provides a way for organizations to avoid, if they use that information well, avoid some of those technical debt traps that we were talking about, where you get painted into a corner needing to upgrade your operating system version because there was a vulnerability in one of the 1,000 of packages that you use, and that's the only fix that's available. So we're basically just going back to history, to the archives, and saying, how has this problem been solved before? How can we transpose that set of solutions to this new world where it's not a bunch of employees on a corporate campus full of cafes and shady spots and trees. It's a bunch of people distributed on the internet collaborating around this stuff. And Tidelift, with our business model, we're able to work with those open source maintainers to bring those packages up to meet those standards. But there's a second part to it, which is how that value gets received. And that's the second half of Tidelift.
Great. Let's go into that.
So the way that organizations want to consume that is they don't want to care about all of those issues, right? And you can actually contrast it to the way that organizations that are doing something around their open source software supply chain security today, typically they're using a mix of tools that are sort of scanners, looking for issues, kind of comparing against a database of known security vulnerabilities against package versions, for example. And who is typically operating those tools? It's the application development team. So now you're responsible for both building your application, maybe compare that to a home builder building a house, but you're also responsible for verifying the moisture content of the lumber that's coming to the job site, and also that the mixing is being done right on the concrete that's going into the foundation. It's kind of on you to verify that there's the right kind of sand is going in there. It's just not a realistic or practical way to approach it, is to put it all on the application development teams to administer all of these aspects of complex trivia around their open source components. So what organizations really want is a place to go to get software building blocks that they can use to build their applications that already meet whatever standards the organization needs. And there's some really good examples in industry of companies that do this super well, that have written publicly about their models. Like Google is one of them, where there's Google has this famous internal monorepo. And one of the features of Google's monorepo is there's a third-party portion of it where there's a set of curated open source, third-party open source packages. And if you're an internal Google developer, you can build your search engine, maps widget, whatever it is, using those components. And you don't have to go and verify that the license is going to meet Google's rules, or that it's security vulnerabilities, whether it has security vulnerabilities. Somebody's already done that in a central location for you.
Right.
So Tidelift, the second part of our business, aside from working with the maintainers to make sure these packages meet these standards or verify that they meet these standards, is a set of tools just like that any organization can buy as a service to get their repository of vetted open source components that they know meet these standards. And again, the reason we know they meet these standards is we went and got the open source creators and maintainers into the loop to help us figure it out. So that's how we kind of provide the whole value to both sides of the equation. The organizations and companies that build with open source receive it through this set of tools and process that is the Tidelift commercial offering, and then also provide value to these open source maintainers, partially in the form of paying them money,
sure.
finally, for the work that they do, but also supporting tools and processes to help them with some of these security issues and licensing arcana and all that kind of stuff.
That's an amazing overview, and in sort of like a Red Hat for the long tail kind of concept, right? It's like all these different things that are out there. Red Hat's only going to cover like the sort of like most commonly used, really like products. And what you're saying is like, hey, we need a way to get to the other, 100,000, libraries and components that are out there being used. And that model, it's like, it doesn't make sense for an organization and a large company to try to tip every project that they use. They can pay into a central kind of service that gives them some tooling, and then also have some percentage of that sort of like redistributed back into the ecosystem of builders.
Yeah, you got it. I mean, the only thing I might contest is the long tail part, which is, people say that a lot, but it's
the medium.
It's like the shoulders of the curve.
Sure.
If you look at the total number of all of the open source lines of code that a typical organization uses, if you bought every pre-existing commercial product, you bought Red Hat and Confluent and every managed service, you would get maybe you cover maybe 10% of your open source code if you bought everything. So it's like, it's actually most of it. And that's one of the exciting things about the opportunity, and challenging things about the scale of it is, how do we address the rest of that stuff that, again, we're already using? Like these financial services companies, governments, they're already using this stuff. They just don't have a plan. And, when things like Log4J happen, it kind of forces the issue.
Yeah, that's a good point. The shoulders through tail of the
there you go.
of the entire distribution. And so, one, I guess, like, tell us a bit, like, how's it going? What's the status of the company, customers, like, all those kind of things. So we get a little context.
Yeah, it's going really well. I mean, it's a heavy lift. It's been a heavy lift to get this going because it back to business models. This is a version of a two-sided marketplace. Mm-hmm. You think about old world things like eBay or whatever. You got to have some inventory on the shelves in order to be able to service customers. And so, a big task for us, and one where there was a lot of opinions expressed about how achievable it would be at the outset, was signing up open source maintainers to be part of this, to basically provide the most important ingredient of this solution that I'm describing, which is the verified open source packages. And a lot of folks said things like, bringing money into the equation is going to ruin the vibe, and people are going to be offended if you offer to pay them money for their open source stuff. And the experiences that we talked about at the start of this conversation at Red Hat were not confirmatory towards that. So I sort of had a perspective that wouldn't be the case. And we've had a tremendous response from open source maintainers when we approach them and sort of explain our model and how we want them to be part of it, and what we're asking them to do and what we're not asking them to do. We've had a great response. And so we're working with the maintainers of thousands of these projects now, and we bring them together in this, what we call the Tidelift catalog, this sort of universe of packages that meet this standard. And now that we have thousands of packages covered there, that's a really compelling offering for organizations. And where we have found the organizations where we have found the most aggressive interest and early adoption are big companies with lots of application developers in regulated industries. So, financial services, healthcare, life sciences, and especially government. And a lot of the government stuff that's been happening recently is driven by, you referenced SolarWinds, the breach that happened about a year ago this time, or that the news broke about a year ago this time. Mm-hmm. The US federal government is intentionally trying to use its buying power to level up the security discipline across the software industry and the technology industry in the United States. And so, there's been a number of important events motivated by the federal government. There was a White House executive order on cybersecurity in May that directed a number of agencies to create standards and policies around this stuff. There's a requirement for organizations that do business with the federal government to supply what's called a software bill of materials. It's the ingredients list. Mm-hmm. What were those building blocks that went into your application, and also to make affirmative assurances around what security practices went into the creation of that product and into those ingredients. Those are really hard things for people to do when they're just winging it, to even have the list. Most organizations are challenged to build the list of what's going into their software, much less to testify that it meets certain security standards. That's a really interesting opportunity for Tidelift and our, partnered open source maintainers to come together with organizations that need to answer these questions and need to, meet these standards, to get it done together in a way that benefits everybody.
Yeah. I mean, it's really interesting. I think, there's definitely like sort of echoes of Replicated that I see in your business as well, which I love, because like we also run somewhat a two-sided marketplace. We're primarily focused just on the vendor side, right? So helping software vendors distribute their products into these large enterprise environments. We don't work directly with the large enterprises. We think of ourselves as like B2B to E in that sense. Yeah. But ultimately our software, like the tooling that we have, the administrative tooling is really all used by the corporate IT admin who's administering these applications.
And really easy to get started, right, Grant? I mean, I know it was effortless to get Replicated off the ground and going with its two-sided marketplace. That's what I remember.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. Yeah. It's like when I was thinking about your business, I was like, man, this is like maybe a harder business to start than Replicated was. I was like that. And that's a, there's not many businesses where I'm like, oh yeah, you had a really long haul to get there because to your point, like it took us a long time to get any kind of momentum moving in either direction. But then the specific challenge that I'm thinking about for your business is just like people are afraid of this topic. Like it's such a big problem. It's almost like they'd rather pretend it doesn't exist, which is, clearly it needs to be solved and clearly there's a ton of value that can be unlocked by it, but it's not like, it's complicated and it's hard to wrap your head around. And it's like, there's no like super, super clear path. I think what you're offering is compelling. And I think the funny thing is there's so many things that we end up modeling after, Google did this. So it's like, sure, you should do the same thing.
Smart people.
Because it works. It's like, and they've thought about it. Yeah. And it was like there was a battle of different ideas and like that wasn't the only thing that was tried to solve this problem at Google. Like there was probably 5 other different solutions that all lost out. And so, there's like a marketplace for ideas there and like a battlefield of ideas where the top, solution wins. So
sure.
Yeah. This is great. I do laugh because I was joking about like your cushy job as a venture capitalist, I clearly love lots of my friends are VCs and they're very important partners of ours. But I'm guessing this has been some of the more challenging parts of your career in terms of actually, building this business and getting this moving. Is that right?
Yes, hard work. Although I think maybe I approach things in a hard way. I wasn't coasting as a VC, I guess. During that phase of my career, I was hustling. But it was a different set of muscles.
Well, you were also building. I would say, like you were a little ahead of the curve then too. Like the things that if you were investing in those things now, you would be like just constantly filled with deals, and everyone would love every deal you were doing because it's like the thesis has really proven out, and so. You see it with all the IPOs that have happened recently. So you just like to take things on before everybody else realizes how crucial they are. So
the triumph of the nerds. I love this pattern. I see it repeated in history, and I can support that one.
So this problem you're talking about, I do feel like people have long tried to say like, this is where, building some type of coin or crypto protocol or other thing, and it's like now we're calling it Web3, might actually pay the creators to build the projects and things. Like, do you have a thesis on that? Do you think it's like part of the solution at some point, something you thought about? I'm just curious.
I think it's really interesting. I've spent time and energy sort of exploring that. And by the way, there are some existing efforts that are, I believe, showing some success on that front, especially around, crypto projects.
Sure.
I think there's some good examples, which naturally is where that would start. Basically, I think let's go back to that marketplace of ideas that you had. Let's try everything, right? Like there's a bunch of complementary things that we can do. This is a really important problem for us to solve because our civilization is built on technology and a bunch of open source libraries. Everybody knows this famous XKCD webcomic with by now with like all of modern technology or something like that sitting on top of a random package that somebody in Nebraska has been maintaining thanklessly since 2003.
Yeah.
We know it. We know it's there. So let's go after this problem. This week it was Log4j was the thankless maintainers, unthanked maintainers, I should say. And so let's go after it with Tidelift. Let's go after it with novel payments approaches, micro payments, if it can work. Let's go after it with direct sponsorships of, open source maintainers on platforms. Some people argue big companies should hire the open source maintainers and make them full-time salaried employees. Great. Let's do that as well. Let's try all of these things. Probably the answer is some mix of them. I think that Tidelift is, to your point, has been a hard to get started one, but is now demonstrating the power of, undertaking that effort. So I think we're already making a meaningful contribution, but we're not going to solve this problem with one approach or one company or one team. This is really important for, again, not even just the technology industry or vendors to focus on. This is important for our society. This is why it's on the front page of the Washington Post, why the White House is making executive orders about this kind of stuff. It's why I couldn't pay my parking meter in the town next door when their system was out because they were patching their Log4j vulnerability last weekend.
Oh, wow.
It impacts real life. We got to take this stuff seriously.
Yeah. No, realistically, that's like your answer is the most sort of perfect open source answer, which is like, well, like the community will figure it out and we'll take different approaches and like we'll get there. And, that's the point. When you started Tidelift, though, I felt like it was much more like, was there always a clear vision around what the product would be? Or was it, because this is when I reversed back 5 years ago. I definitely remember the community aspect. I don't remember as much of the tooling and sort of the sort of enterprise tooling around this. So like, was that always part of the vision? It's just like, the way that you started was like, hey, we need to get the software or the open source developers on first.
Yeah, well, so I think the idea of tooling has always been present from the beginning. That's how we would convey it in a form where organizations can consume it, right? That work that's happening and actually put it to work and derive value from it, and thus be motivated to pay for value that they receive. The details of it, though, have been hard won. It's enterprise software development, right? Like, no plan survives contact with the enemy, as they say, right? You have these grand ideas of what the software is going to look like, the UIs are going to look like, the user experience. And so it's another aspect of the business that I don't know a way to shortcut this aspect of building a enterprise software business, or probably most kinds of businesses. You have to get out there and just start doing it. And so, we have had some great learnings as we've gone along. I would say a core, kind of principle that is well known but well advised is simplify, right? Like, make it as simple as possible for people to understand what's going on and to actually interact with it. And so, an example of that from our product journey would be, initially we had the idea of this universe of open source components that we were working with the maintainers to verify they meet these objective standards. And then we had like your organization's universe of whatever you happen to be using. And then we had sort of this, we called it a alignment score, like how aligned are you to the verified versions? And it was it's too complicated to understand, right? So a simplification that we kind of discovered in our conversations along the way is, let's simplify the problem by just saying, we're going to create a list of components that are in use in your organization and tell you whether they are healthy or not. So that's called your catalog, your organization's catalog. It's sort of fed with information from our universe of maintainers and also your things. And then we just give you rather than talking about like abstract things around, alignment and how far behind the versions you are, we just give you a straight number. And we actually just have recently shipped an enhanced version of this we call Project Health that just looks at your application and it says, we're just going to give you a bottom line score based on the open source components that are flowing into it. You are what you eat. Your application is what it's made out of. Here's the health score. And, that health score changes over time. When there's a new security vulnerability, if your application is incorporating a version of Log4j that is not patched, your health score just went way down suddenly. Yeah. And so our tooling kind of throws a spotlight on that and says, hey, here's what you need to do to make the biggest impact to restore and improve your project health score. So it's like creating simplifying concepts and just removing as many steps as possible in the use of the software. I guess those are perennial wisdom for anybody building a software product, probably for any audience.
Yeah, which is change is hard for enterprise software too, because you're like, someone will be like, I loved that thing. And you're like, well, we got rid of it because no one else understood it, right? So you have to be kind of...
Yeah, that's why Log4j still had the JNDI interface in it, because somebody loved that ability to load code through their LDAP server.
That's exactly it. And I'm just sort of, trying to figure out like, what other, like, you've clearly had a very long and sort of successful relationship in open source. Like, what other patterns or frameworks or paradigms have like sort of stuck out to you where you're like, hey, when I look at an open source business, I always look for these things, or this is the stuff that I think is going to help them be successful, or here's the, transitions I try to help people think about. Like, what are some of those key insights?
Yeah, I think just my personal point of view on this is that I focus less on the businesses in open source and more on the communities. I think that's the source of the energy and where it comes from. So I think in terms of the attributes of those communities, and there's a bunch of those are human ecologies, right?
Right.
And so I look at things like who's participating there. Is it just are the end users an important voice and participant in those communities? I mentioned a couple of the sort of scientific computing and data science communities that I've been adjacent to in my travels. Those are examples of communities where it's not like vendors just teeing things up. It's like the end users are technical users, and they build libraries to do things like, in applied domains like astrophysics or biology, and they're co-creating the overall ecosystem. Now, that's a really, really interesting dynamic when you have users who are also creators like that. Of course, there's things like how centralized or single organization dominated a community is. Just like in real world ecologies, diverse open source communities are more robust to all kinds of different threats, either political threats like, a vendor sort of taking over and relicensing the code to serve their commercial interests. When there's a shared ownership or shared governance, communities and open source projects will be more resilient against that. But also things like security bugs, right? To have different people with different perspectives, use cases, personal backgrounds looking at the same code, they'll see different things. They'll take a different approach to how they investigate things, maybe apply different tools or different methodologies to looking for potential issues and heading them off ahead of time. So it's those kind of, I think the bottom line there is diverse open source communities and sub-communities that have active involvement from their end users and participation in the co-creation. That's the jackpot. When I see that, I can't help but try to show up and find a way to help. And, with Tidelift, we're trying to do that for a bunch of communities like that.
Right.
There's communities like that in the JavaScript ecosystem, in the .NET ecosystem, in Go, and in the Python ecosystem. And so we're trying to provide a little bit of a general umbrella where sub-communities like that can thrive. And boy, I just think it's like one of the most interesting things to emerge from the internet is that humans will get together and self-organize to create things like this and to work on projects like this. Who wouldn't want to support that and find ways to amplify it?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of have there's a couple other sort of random ideas that just came to mind around this, which is like I'm sure you've thought about them. That's why I want to run them by you. But like things just around, Tidelifts feels like it's in a good position where like there are lots of companies out there that have great engineers and we want to give back and want to contribute. So like even just, helping to identify, hey, here are the software projects that like need your help. And, if you think about like a free version of Tidelift that looks at my stack and says, hey, look, like you're using all the, these are actually core dependencies. And these are projects that don't really have like super active communities or maintainers. Like, have somebody get involved, right? Like that would be really interesting as ways to think about making contributions. It feels like clearly there's lots of different solutions to this stuff, but like some idea of almost like a Tidelift job board, right? Where it's like just, you see all these great folks that are making contributions to projects. It's like they're probably, I would happily employ those folks at Replicated while they still maintain that project and get paid, some amount of side hustle money from Tidelift, but also, get to work on software here and use some of their time at Replicated to contribute that project, right? So there feels like there's lots of ways where like your insights could be super, super helpful in solving this problem. So really cool.
I love those ideas. I mean, on the first one, we do a version of that already. So like when we onboard a customer, we inventory their open source projects that they're using today. And if we don't have partnered maintainers helping us ensure the standards that those packages meet, we'll actively reach out to open source maintainers. That's how we identified who we should sort of prioritize to try to onboard going forward. So it's a cool way to do it because it directly aligns our community, open source maintainer community engagement with value received by our customers. So it sort of amplifies the thing.
Yeah.
But yeah, I love the idea. There's a lot of things. Once you have some of this basic infrastructure and you fight through the two-sided marketplace activation and get that flywheel going, there's a lot of stuff that you can build on top of it that's kind of good for everybody. And these are a couple of good examples. And so that's, yeah, it's gratifying to have the opportunity to do it.
Yeah, I mean, it's also just like as terrible as things like Log4j are, like it's great that there's some amount of like more attention and visibility going to this problem, right? So, I think it was sort of inevitable, and this is probably part of the overall thesis for you. Or like, look, eventually this stuff is going to be the fire that everyone has to put out, and so if you build in that direction, you kind of have that hypothesis, and you stay alive long enough, which is like the key thing I think that's one of the hardest things for category creation, and like is just like stay alive long enough until like everybody realizes that there's value there. So you've done that thus far. Good work.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, one way that we have reacted to Log4j is, never let a crisis go to waste, I think is another catchphrase. I'm not sure who attribute it to, but it's actually a bummer that, this happened. I mean, it's a bummer for a lot of people, for the open source maintainers. It's not been a fun week. For a lot of people lost their last weekend, maybe this weekend, the week in between, derailed and, patching things. But on the other hand, it's sort of a call to action, right? Like it happened, and it happened big this time, and it's going to happen again.
Yeah.
So let's, think ahead. I mean, there's other things going on in the world that maybe match this pattern as well. People said it might happen. We weren't really prepared. Something happened. Let's not just deal with the issue, but let's also try to get ahead of it next time. And so, I think if we do that, if we respond in a mature way, deal with, we got to clean up Log4Shell right now, but then let's not forget about it and set ourselves up to have another one come whenever it comes. Let's figure out a better way for everybody to work together that benefits everybody. That's our perspective on it.
Yeah, put out the fire and then build some, sprinkler systems in.
Exactly. Yeah, maybe we should have a fire department.
Yeah, have a fire department. Yeah, exactly. Or take out all the highly flammable things.
Yeah, lots of ways to approach it. Let's do all of them.
Amazing, Donald. Thank you so much for joining. This was a ton of fun. I appreciate you allowing me to badger you with questions about Red Hat and trying to, pierce your memory from 13 years ago, and then diving in on the modern problems you're solving at Tidelift. But I really do appreciate it.
All good. Thanks, Grant, for the invitation, and really enjoyed it. It's a privilege to do this. It's a privilege to work with open source communities and to have gone on this journey. So happy to talk about it and share any findings to date that might be useful for others who are trying to get enterprise ready on their own. Yeah,
and if people are trying to find you, where should they find you?
You can find me, Tidelift.com is a good place, 2 words. And you can find me on Twitter. My handle is DFF.
Cool. Donald, thanks again.
Thanks, Grant.
That's all we have time for today. If you're interested in being a guest on this show, or if you'd like to suggest a topic, or just to learn more about enterprise features, find us at EnterpriseReady.io. To learn more about Heavybit, visit Heavybit.com to check out the library. It's packed with amazing talks on sales, marketing, product, and general management from founders of developer tools companies and other industry leaders. This podcast is also brought to you by my company, Replicated, where we enable cloud-native software vendors like HashiCorp, CircleCI, Sneak, and many others to operationalize and scale the distribution of their modern on-prem applications to their largest enterprise customers. Check us out at replicated.com.